Hello, I'm Tony Collins and this is the Rugby Reloaded podcast. Today we're going to correct what in hindsight seems a strange anomaly in the series so far and talk for the first time about the history of the game in Australia, and in particular look at the origins of rugby down under and the emergence of rugby league. Football of any type in Australia was first recorded in Sydney in 1829 when the Sydney Monitor newspaper reported that soldiers at Sydney Barracks had been playing football. It didn't say what type of football or what rules were used, but it wasn't until the middle of 1865 that the first rugby football clubs were started in Sydney. Of course, Melbourne had its own football game, now known as Wallaroos, that had begun in 1859. Progress for rugby, however, was slow. By May 1877, the Southern Rugby Football Union, the then governing body in Australia, had only 13 members. The turning point eventually came in 1882 when Brisbane FC wrote to the leading Sydney club, the Wallaroos, suggesting a game between the two sides. 4,000 spectators turned out at the Sydney Cricket Ground to see the first match of the tour. New South Wales defeated the touring Brisbane side, but the visitors then shocked the Sydney sports scene by winning their next two matches. Regular interstate matches followed, and Queensland's victory over New South Wales in Sydney for the first time ever in 1886 sealed rugby's status as the number one football code in New South Wales and Queensland. As Queensland had demonstrated, nothing stimulated interest in rugby as much as matches against touring teams. So in 1882, New South Wales dispatched a team to New Zealand to become the first ever rugby tourists to the Shaky Isles. Fortunately for both colonies, the tour ended equitably with New South Wales winning 4 games and the New Zealanders triumphing in 3. Another rugby rivalry had been established. The success of that New Zealand tour and the crowds that now turned up to watch the battles between New South Wales and Queensland helped lift rugby to new heights of popularity. Australia in the 1880s was in the midst of an industrial boom. Sydney and Brisbane both doubled their populations. The advent of the 8-hour working day and the Saturday half holiday across Australia meant that industrial workers now had leisure time to fill, and few activities proved to be as popular as rugby. So the game began to spread rapidly in the industrial heartlands of New South Wales and Queensland, and, just as in England, the entrance of working class players into rugby brought new and intractable problems to the sport. The leaders of Australian rugby shared the English RFU's fears that the influx of working class players and spectators would mean that control of the game would slip from their grasp. Despite the growth of the game in Sydney, rugby was still dominated by upper-class gentlemen's clubs like the Wallaroos and Sydney University. These were clubs based on social networks and had no ties to local communities. In contrast, more and more of the newer clubs began to represent local areas, and especially working-class regions such as Balmain, Glebe and Newtown. Just as in Northern England, rumours also soon began to circulate that the best working-class players were paid money and other inducements to play for certain clubs. In early 1898, the New South Wales Rugby Union investigated claims that New South Wales players Billy Howe and George Outram had received payments to play in the previous season's matches against Queensland. Yet calls for working class players to be properly compensated for travel and other expenses were increasingly heard in the Sydney sporting press. The clash between rugby's past and its emerging future was symbolically highlighted in 1898 when the blue-blooded Wallaroos played the recently formed Sydney FC, comprising working-class Sydney-siders. It was a vicious, spiteful and bloody match, but at the end of it, Sydney FC emerged victorious by 15 points to 5. The writing was on the wall. The rigorous amateurism favoured by the RFU and the New South Wales Rugby Union seemed unfair to the average Aussie. More to the point, it seemed downright hypocritical. The British tours of 1899 and 1904 and New Zealand's numerous visit brought money pouring into rugby's coffers. 34,000 people saw the first test match between Australia and Great Britain at the Sydney Cricket Ground in 1904. Major club matches in the early 1900s could also pull in crowds of up to 20,000 people. Yet none of that cash found its way openly to players. Indeed, they often found themselves out of pocket because of the distances they had to travel and the time they took off work to play the game. Things reached a boiling point at the start of the 1907 season when the rugby authorities shut down the official medical insurance scheme for injured players, despite income from matches almost trebling between 1902 and 1906. This meant that players now had to pay their own insurance premiums. At the same time, The Metropolitan Rugby Union, which ran the club game in Sydney, voted to increase its secretary's salary to £250 a year, roughly twice the average annual wage of a manual worker. In 1907, the All Blacks played New South Wales at the Sydney Cricket Ground. An Australian record 52,000 people saw the visitors triumph 11-3. But while the game brought over £2,500 into rugby union coffers, one of rugby's star forwards, Docker Alec Burden, was left unable to work after damaging his arm and shoulder a few weeks earlier. The ending of rugby's insurance scheme meant that he received no money while injured. Players' resentment at their treatment at the hands of the rugby union leadership was now at breaking point. Blair Swannell, a Scottish tourist to Australia with the 1899 and 1904 British sides who now lived in Sydney, warned that the players will take the matter into their own hands and go from one extreme to another, electing to office officials pledged to what every lover of rugby football should strive to prevent: professionalism. It would also be a tour that precipitated the crisis that blew Australian rugby apart forever. In 1906, the Auckland City Rugby Union team visited Sydney. In the team were 4 members of the triumphant 1905 All Black tours to Britain, including George Smith and Charlie Sealing. Strong circumstantial evidence suggests that Smith met with disgruntled Sydney rugby players and discussed the possibility of starting a Northern Union Rugby League competition in Australia. At the same time, Victor Trumper, arguably Australia's greatest batsman before Don Bradman, and Labour Party politician Harry Hoyle were also actively seeking to organise the discontented rugby players. Regular meetings began to be held at Trumper's sporting goods shop in Sydney's Market Street. Shortly after Albert Baskerville's proposed New Zealand tour to Britain had been accepted by the Northern Union, glebe forward Peter Moyer turned up at one of Trumper's meetings with a telegram from George Smith, who was by now one of Albert Baskerville's closest collaborators. It asked if the group would be prepared to organise a team to play the New Zealand side in Sydney on its way to the UK. The meeting agreed unanimously, fully aware that the next steps they took would be momentous ones. In late June, a Sydney newspaper warned that Baskerville's New Zealand side, known as the Professional All Blacks, could include Australian players. By the start of August, the trickle of rumours about a breakaway rugby league had become a torrent, and Sydney held its breath for the arrival of the Rugby Rebels from New Zealand. On the 8th of August 1907, 50 people, including representatives of 8 clubs and first 5 grade team captains, met at Bateman's Crystal Hotel on Sydney's George Street. Chaired by Harry Hoyle, the meeting voted to set up the New South Wales Rugby Football League and organise a committee to select a team to play against the shortly arriving Professional All Blacks. 4 days later, Daly Messenger, the Eastern Suburbs three-quarter and the biggest name in Australian rugby, announced that he too was joining the New South Wales Rugby Football League. He was just one of 138 players who had signed up with the new organisation. Soon after, Baskerville's team arrived in Sydney. Dubbed the All Goals by their opponents in the press to emphasise their allegedly mercenary instincts, although the team's profits would be divided equally between all players, similar to the financial arrangements of Australian cricket tourists. The Rugby Rebels drew 20,000 people to the first of 3 matches against New South Wales on the 17th of August. The series was played under Rugby Union rules, as the Northern Union rulebooks had yet to arrive from England. A week later, Daly Messenger announced that he would be joining Baskerville's team as a guest player on their British tour. In mid-September, the Australian Rugby Union authorities banned everyone who had played against the All Goals, once more highlighting the unfairness of old-school rugby. Rugby League was now up and running, and the New South Wales Rugby Football League was confident of its success. As the tumultuous 1907 season ended, frenzied activity carried on behind the scenes. In January 1908, rugby league clubs were founded in all of the major districts of working-class Sydney. The league was formed because it was believed that the set of conditions controlling the rugby football unions were not suitable for the democracy and social conditions of the Australian people, Harry Hoyle told the meeting that created the Glebe Club. 9 clubs were admitted to the first New South Wales Rugby League Premiership, which kicked off on the 20th of April 1908. The previous month in Brisbane, the Queensland Rugby Association had been founded and immediately affiliated itself with the New South Wales RFL. Bolstered by the tremendous success of the All Goals Tour of Britain, the Northern Union agreed to an Australian side touring the UK the next season. In May 1908, the inaugural Rugby League Test match was played between Australia and New Zealand. Henceforth, the Kangaroos would be the name that the National Rugby League team would be known. This, at last, was a sport that the warehousemen, wharfies and manual workers of New South Wales and Queensland could finally call a game of their own. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Rugby Reloaded podcast. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my name is @CollinsTony, and if you want to dig a bit deeper into the history of rugby and the other football codes, take a look at the Rugby Reloaded website at www.rugbyreloaded.com. Until next week, thanks for listening.